To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. Part 1, The Window. Yes, of course, if it's fine tomorrow, said Mrs. Ramsay. But you'll have to be up with the lark, she added. To her son, these words conveyed an extraordinary joy, as if it were settled. The expedition were bound to take place, and the wonder to which he had looked forward for years and years, it seemed, was, after a night's darkness and a day's sail, within touch. Since he belonged, even at the age of 6, to that great clan which cannot keep this feeling separate from that, but must let future prospects, with their joys and sorrows, cloud what is actually at hand, since to such people, even in earliest childhood, any turn in the wheel of sensation has the power to crystallize and transfix the moment upon which its gloom or radiance rests. James Ramsay, sitting on the floor cutting out pictures from the illustrated catalog of the Army and Navy stores, endowed the picture of a refrigerator, as his mother spoke, with heavenly bliss. It was fringed with joy. The wheelbarrow, the lawnmower, the sound of poplar trees, leaves whitening before rain, rooks cawing, brooms knocking, dresses rustling, all these were so colored and distinguished in his mind that he had already his private code, his secret language, though he appeared the image of stark and uncompromising severity, with his high forehead and his fierce blue eyes, impeccably candid and pure, frowning slightly at the sight of human frailty, so that his mother, watching him guide his scissors neatly round the refrigerator, imagined him all red and ermine on the bench or directing a stern and momentous enterprise in some crisis of public affairs. But, said his father, stopping in front of the drawing-room window, it won't be fine. Had there been an axe handy, or a poker, any weapon that would have gashed a hole in his father's breast and killed him, there and then, James would have seized it. Such were the extremes of emotion that Mr. Ramsay excited in his children's breasts by his mere presence. Standing as now, lean as a knife, narrow as the blade of one, grinning sarcastically, not only with the pleasure of disillusioning his son and casting ridicule upon his wife, who was 10,000 times better in every way than he was, James thought, but also with some secret conceit at his own accuracy of judgment. What he said was true. It was always true. He was incapable of untruth, never tampered with a fact, never altered a disagreeable word to suit the pleasure or convenience of any mortal being, least of all of his own children, who, sprung from his loins, should be aware from childhood that life is difficult, facts uncompromising, and the passage to that fabled land where our brightest hopes are extinguished, our frail barks founder in darkness. Here Mr. Ramsay would straighten his back and narrow his little blue eyes upon the horizon, one that needs above all courage, truth, and the power to endure. But it may be fine. I expect it will be fine, said Mrs. Ramsay, making some little twist of the reddish-brown stocking she was knitting impatiently. If she finished it tonight, if they did go to the lighthouse, after all, it was to be given to the lighthouse keeper for his little boy, who was threatened with a tuberculous hip, together with a pile of old magazines and some tobacco, indeed, whatever she could find lying about, not really wanted, but only littering the room, to give those poor fellows, who must be bored to death sitting all day, with nothing to do but polish the lamp and trim the wick and rake about on their scrap of garden, something to amuse them. For how would you like to be shut up for a whole month at a time, and possibly more in stormy weather, upon a rock the size of a tennis lawn? She would ask, and to have no letters or newspapers, and to see nobody. If you were married, not to see your wife, not to know how your children were, if they were ill, if they had fallen down and broken their legs or arms, to see the same dreary waves breaking week after week, and then a dreadful storm coming, and the windows covered with spray, and birds dashed against the lamp, and the whole place rocking, and not be able to put your nose out of doors for fear of being swept into the sea? How would you like that? She asked, addressing herself particularly to her daughters. So she added rather differently, one must take them whatever comforts one can. It's due west, said the atheist Tansley, holding his bony fingers spread so that the wind blew through them, for he was sharing Mr. Ramsay's evening walk up and down the terrace. That is to say, the wind blew from the worst possible direction for landing at the lighthouse. Yes, he did say disagreeable things, Mrs. Ramsay admitted, It was odious of him to rub this in and make James still more disappointed. But at the same time, she would not let them laugh at him. The atheist, they called him. The little atheist. Rose mocked him, Prue mocked him, Andrew, Jasper, Roger mocked him. Even old Badger, without a tooth in his head, had bit him for being, as Nancy put it, the 110th young man to chase them all the way up to the Hebrides, when it was ever so much nicer to be alone. Nonsense, said Mrs. Ramsay with great severity. Apart from the habit of exaggeration which they had from her and from the implication, which was true, that she asked too many people to stay and had to lodge some in the town, she could not bear incivility to her guests, to young men in particular, who were poor as church mice, quote, exceptionally able, end of quote, her husband said, his great admirers, and come there for a holiday. Indeed, she had the whole of the other sex under her protection. For reasons she could not explain, for their chivalry and valor, for the fact that they negotiated treaties, ruled India, controlled finance, finally for an attitude towards herself, which no woman could fail to feel or to find agreeable, something trustful, childlike, reverential, which an old woman could take from a young man without loss of dignity, and woe betide the girl, pray heaven it was none of her daughters, who did not feel the worth of it and all that it implied to the marrow of her bones. She turned with severity upon Nancy. He had not chased them, she said. He had been asked. They must find a way out of it all. There might be some simpler way, some less laborious way, she sighed. When she looked in the glass and saw her hair gray, her cheeks sunk at 50, she thought possibly she might have managed things better. Her husband, money, his books. But for her own part, she would never for a single second regret her decision, evade difficulties, or slur over duties. She was now formidable to behold, and it was only in silence, looking up from their plates after she had spoken so severely about Charles Tansley, that her daughters, Prue, Nancy, Rose, could sport with infidel ideas which they had brewed for themselves of a life different from hers. In Paris, perhaps. A wilder life, not always taking care of some man or other, for there was in all their minds a mute questioning of deference and chivalry, of the Bank of England and the Indian Empire, of ringed fingers and lace, though to them all there was something in this of the essence of beauty, which called out the manliness in their girlish hearts, and made them, as they sat at table beneath their mother's eyes, honor her strange severity, her extreme courtesy, like a queen's raising from the mud to wash a beggar's dirty foot, when she thus admonished them so very severely about that wretched atheist who had chased them, or, speaking accurately, been invited to stay with them in the Isles of Skye. "There will be no landing at the Lighthouse tomorrow," said Charles Tansley, clapping his hands together as he stood at the window with her husband. Surely he had said enough. She wished they would both leave her and James alone and go on talking. She looked at him. He was such a miserable specimen, the children said, all humps and hollows. He couldn't play cricket. He poked. He shuffled. He was a sarcastic brute, Andrew said. They knew what he liked best, to be forever walking up and down with Mr. Ramsay, and saying who had won this, who had won that, who was a, quote, first-rate man, end of quote, at Latin verses, who was, quote, brilliant but I think fundamentally unsound, end of quote, who was undoubtedly the, quote, ablest fellow in Balliol, end of quote, who had buried his light temporarily at Bristol or Bedford but was bound to be heard of later, when his prolegomena, of which Mr. Tansley had the first pages in proof with him, if Mr. Ramsay would like to see them, to some branch of mathematics or philosophy saw the light of day. That was what they talked about. She could not help laughing herself sometimes. She said the other day something about waves mountains high. Yes, said Charles Tansley, it was a little rough. Aren't you drenched to the skin, she had said. Damp, not wet through, said Mr. Tansley, pinching his sleeve, feeling his socks. But it was not that they minded, the children said. It was not his face. It was not his manners. It was him, his point of view. When they talked about something interesting, people, music, history, anything, even said it was a fine evening, so why not sit out of doors? Then what they complained of about Charles Tansley was that until he had turned the whole thing round and made it somehow reflect himself and disparage them, he was not satisfied. And he would go to picture galleries, they said, and he would ask one, did one like this tie? God knows, said Rose, one did not. Disappearing as stealthily as stags from the dinner table directly the meal was over, the 8 sons and daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay sought their bedrooms, their fastnesses in a house where there was no other privacy to debate anything, everything. Tansley's tie, the passing of the Reform Bill, seabirds and butterflies people while the sun poured into those attics, which a plank alone separated from each other so that every footstep could be plainly heard, and the Swiss girl sobbing for her father who was dying of cancer in a valley of the Grissons, and lit up bats, flannels, straw hats, ink pots, paint pots, beetles, and the skulls of small birds, while it drew from the long frilled strips of seaweed pinned to the wall a smell of salt and weeds, which was in the towels too, gritty with sand from bathing. Strife, divisions, difference of opinion, prejudices twisted into the very fiber of being. Oh, that they should begin so early, Mrs. Ramsay deplored. They were so critical, her children. They talked such nonsense. She went from the dining room holding James by the hand, since he would not go with the others. It seemed to her such nonsense inventing differences when people, heaven knows, were different enough without that. The real differences, she thought, standing by the drawing-room window, are enough, quite enough. She had in mind at that moment rich and poor, high and low, the great in birth receiving from her, some half grudgingly, half respect, for had she not in her veins the blood of that very noble, if slightly mythical, Italian house, whose daughters, scattered about English drawing-rooms in the 19th century, had lisped so charmingly, had stormed so wildly, and all her wit and her bearing and her temper came from them, and not from the sluggish English or the cold Scotch, but more profoundly she ruminated the other problem, of rich and poor and the things she saw with her own eyes, weekly, daily, here or in London when she visited this widow, or that struggling wife in person with a bag on her arm, and a notebook and pencil with which she wrote down in columns carefully ruled for the purpose wages and spendings, employment and unemployment, in the hope that thus she would cease to be a private woman, whose charity was half a sop to her own indignation, half a relief to her own curiosity, and become what with her untrained mind she greatly admired, an investigator, elucidating the social problem.